morning. It's Uncle Lou here. Yeah, that's right. It's me, Uncle Lou, and I'm live for you on LouTube today. So thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I've been in a coma since Friday. Did I miss anything this weekend? It's time for another top 10 list. We do this every week after all the games are played. I try to do it on Sunday night most weeks, but as some of you know, and you all should be aware, Uncle Lou had a rough weekend. So it's Monday morning, and we're doing the top 10 list. So we've had 7 weeks of football now, plus week 0. So this is going to be the week 8, 2019 college football Uncle Lou top 10 poll. Let's go. All right, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you're not already. I post college football videos every single day of the year. Yes, I'm a Georgia Bulldogs fan, but I'm a college football fan, really. Georgia just happens to be my favorite team. So if there's a reason you're not subscribed, go ahead and do that now. Hit the thumbs up button, and we're going to get started with the video. I'm going to do this the same way we do every top 10. So if you've seen the other ones, you know what to expect here. I'm going to put last week's top 10 poll up on the screen so you know where I was starting from as a reference point heading into today's brand new top 10 poll. Again, this is not the AP poll, the coaches poll, a playoff poll. This is my top 10 as of today. I move teams around a lot within the top 10 week to week, based on, overall performance for the year and then what you've done recently. In other words, this past weekend. So you lose a game, you're going to fall. You barely beat a team you shouldn't beat, you're going to fall. You blow out a team that's pretty good, you're going to move up, things like that. The biggest complaint, and I hear a bunch of them, but the biggest complaint I get about the AP and the coaches and polls like that is that teams don't move enough up and down within the polls based on week to week performance. It's like, you in the AP or the coaches poll, you almost have to lose a game to drop down. That's a big complaint I hear. That's not the case with my poll. I move teams around week to week based on who I think looks the best right now. So anyway, here we go. Here's last week's top 10. You can see, obviously you got a couple of top 10 teams from my poll that lost, one of which being my Georgia Bulldogs. But nevertheless, last week from 10 to 1, I had Florida, Penn State, Notre Dame, LSU, OU, Wisconsin, Clemson, Bama, Georgia, Ohio State. So here we go. We'll see how the poll changes for this week. We're going to do it the same way. We'll start at number 10, work our way down to number 1. I'll do my best to explain my reasoning for some of the picks that I make, especially teams that I happen to move around. I don't expect everyone to agree with my top 10, but I do put some time, thought, effort, and energy into making this top 10. So be sure and let me know down in the comments below if there's any teams you think I got really, really wrong. Listen, if I have a team 4 and you think they should be 3, don't waste your time crying about that. But if I have somebody 8 or 9, you think they should be 2 or 3, or if I have somebody way too high, or is there a team that's not in my top 10 that you think I should have in there? Let me know. All right, here we go. We're going to start with number 10, work the way down. Coming in at number 10 this week in the Uncle Lou poll, through no fault of their own, Notre Dame. I had Notre Dame 8 last week, so they've fallen 2 spots in this week's poll. Okay, I'm going to do, I'll do 10, 9, and 8, and then I'll explain why I have 10, 9, and 8 where I do. But, of course, Notre Dame this past week beat Southern Cal at home. Southern Cal is not a very good team, and they beat them 30-27. Obviously, it's better to beat a team that's not very good than it is to lose to one. And again, I'm not punishing Notre Dame here. The reason Notre Dame fell is not because they only beat Southern Cal by 3. It's just because of some things that happened around them, with the teams around them. And again, I'll explain more of that in a second. But they did beat Southern Cal 30-27. They have a bye week next week, right? So they're currently sitting at what? They 5-1, 6-1. Their only loss was on the road at Georgia. Was that a 6-point loss, 23-17. So pretty good Notre Dame team here. I told you after the Georgia game, I think Notre Dame's going 11-1. They still got that Michigan game coming up. I know Michigan's had some struggles, especially offensively. If you're looking for Notre Dame to lose another game, that's probably the one you're pointing to. We'll see. I do think it'll be a good game. Notre Dame has to play them in the Big House at Michigan, and it'll probably be a night game. So, we'll see. But I've got Notre Dame this week at number 10. Now, coming in at number 9 on the poll, a big drop for this team, my Georgia Bulldogs. I have them at 9. Again, I'm going to talk more about 8, 9, and 10 in a minute after I do number 8. But, of course, everyone knows by now Georgia lost this past weekend at home to an unranked 2-3 South Carolina team. The worst loss of any team in the top 10 or 15, without question. The win over Notre Dame, I think, is helping Georgia a little bit right now to stay in the top 10. Obviously, Georgia's got a ton of work to do if they want to finish the season in the top 10, though. They've got some tough games coming up with Florida, Auburn, Texas A&M, Kentucky this week. No excuse for the loss Georgia had this past weekend. It was the worst home loss for the University of Georgia since the 60s. And what I mean by that is it was the first time Georgia has lost to an unranked team at home while being ranked within the top 5 since the 60s. So really a head-scratching loss there from Georgia. Some serious questions for Kirby Smart and the coaching staff and the players to ask themselves and each other as they get ready to take on the second half of this season here, which is much tougher than the first half of the season was. Really, you had the Notre Dame game in the first half of the season. Other than that, there was nothing in the first 6 or 7 games on Georgia's schedule that anybody considered any chance of being a loss, including the South Carolina game. So a huge disappointment this past weekend for UGA. Without that win over Notre Dame, they definitely would be out of the top 10. I think they're in the top 10 still in the coaches and the AP poll too. I'm not sure about that, but I think they are. Anyway, Georgia next week at home against Kentucky. Georgia better come out and beat them by 40 points. Kentucky is another team that is not very good. Talent-wise, Georgia is miles ahead of teams like Kentucky and South Carolina, so it's hard to pin the blame on anything other than coaching and development at this point. I know Jake Fromm played a terrible game, but Georgia's offense has just not looked right for a couple of years, in my opinion, but particularly this season. I've got Georgia at number 9. At number 8, I have Florida. Florida, a better team than I gave them credit for the first month of the season. I thought they played pretty good in that loss to LSU this past weekend. Being at home, I think, obviously was a huge advantage for LSU. I mean, that goes without saying. Florida, of course, enjoyed that same advantage the week before at home against a pretty good Auburn team where they were able to come out on top by a couple of scores. This time, they fall by a couple of scores on the road at LSU. What score that game? That game was 42 to 28. So another big win for LSU, but a loss for Florida on the road here. That puts them, that was their first loss of the season. I have them ranked ahead of Georgia. I think the reasons are obvious. Their loss is obviously a better loss than Georgia's. I know they lost by 2 touchdowns, and Georgia only lost by 3 in double overtime. But look at the competition. I don't feel like I need to explain why I have Florida ahead of Georgia. I think it's pretty obvious. You got 2 teams that have both looked pretty good for the majority of the season. They each have 1 loss. One team loses to an unranked team with a losing record at home. One team loses to a top 5 team on the road at night by 2 scores. I think it's pretty obvious why Florida's ranked ahead of Georgia. All right, let me say this about the Notre Dame, Georgia, and Florida rankings here. And I also want to mention, if this was a top 12 poll, because this was very hard. I think 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are almost indistinguishable at this point. I would have Auburn and Oregon if this was a top 12 poll. I would have Auburn and Oregon in that order, okay? Florida, of course, beat Auburn, so I think at this point you have to have Florida ahead of them. Auburn has a good win over Oregon, so I think you'd have to have Auburn over Oregon. Notre Dame's loss is right up there in terms of quality losses with the Auburn loss and with the Oregon loss. If someone wants to put Auburn or Oregon at number 10 instead of Notre Dame, I've got no problem with that. Hell, if you want to put one of them, if you want to put both of them in and put Georgia and Notre Dame out, I think you can make a case for that too. It's very hard for me to distinguish right now between 8, 9, 10 on my poll and Auburn and Oregon. Now, of course, a lot of this stuff is going to work itself out. Florida and Georgia play in a few weeks, right? Auburn's got tough games coming up against LSU, Alabama at the end of the season. Oregon plays Washington soon, which is a pretty good team. They haven't looked as good as Oregon, but probably the second or third best team in the Pac-12. We'll see what they do there. Notre Dame's got the game at Michigan. So these teams have some pretty tough games coming up. This stuff will work itself out. All 5 of these teams are not going to be sitting on one loss come the 1st of November when the playoff poll comes out. So a lot of that stuff will work itself out. Again, feel free to tell me I'm wrong on 8, 9, and 10, and feel free to tell me where Auburn and Oregon should be. And I agree. It's just hard for me to distinguish it, so that's how I came down on it right there, and that's sort of the reasonings why I have the teams ranked where I do, 10, 9, and 8, and Auburn and Oregon very close. You could almost have 3 teams tied for 10th, really, Notre Dame, Auburn, and Oregon, if you wanted to put it that way. All right, moving on to the undefeated. Well, there are some undefeated teams that aren't even in the top 10. You're talking about teams like Minnesota, Baylor, SMU, Boise State. Those are not top 10 teams, in my opinion. But here come the undefeated teams that are definitely top 10 teams, at least right now, at this point in the season. All right, at number 7, I've got Penn State. Penn State has looked really, really good in every single game they've played this year, with the exception of one, that being the Pitt game where they won 17-10, sort of a weird game there. They've blown out everybody else they've played up until this past weekend when they played Iowa on the road. But is Iowa a great team? No, but Iowa's a good team. They play good defense. Penn State had to play them there. This was definitely Penn State's toughest game of the year so far. They came out on top. What was the final score of that one? Can't read my own writing. Why does that always happen? I don't know. But it does always happen, though. I think they won like 17-12. It was some kind of weird score like that. So 17-12. But they're still undefeated. They've looked a lot better, I think, than most people thought they would. They've definitely been a better team this year than I thought they would. I spent a lot of time this offseason when people would ask me about Penn State, and I'd say, well, I don't think they're going to have a down year or a rebuilding year, but it does sort of seem like a transitional year. A lot of new parts and pieces on the offense, running back, quarterback. But their defense has played really good. Their quarterback, I think, has played above what most people thought you would get from that position this year. And so far, so good for Penn State. Halfway through the season, they're undefeated. A lot of blowout wins. Again, I'm not trying to pump Iowa up like they're a top 10 team or an elite team, but a win on the road at Iowa, you have to at least consider that a good win. Maybe not a great win, but I think you have to consider that a pretty good win. So I have them this week in the UNCLELOU poll at number 7. All right, that brings us to number 6. That's going to be the Oklahoma Sooners. Listen, it's really hard. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I think, can go in almost any order. I think Penn State is a step below these top 6 teams, but I think cases can be made for any of these other teams coming up after Penn State, starting with OU. Obviously, a case can be made that they have looked like or should be ranked number 1. There are different arguments you can make for each team to put them number 1. There's different arguments you can make for each team to put them 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. But I do think these are definitely the teams that should be in everyone's top 6. So I know there's going to be some people who think OU should be higher than 6, and I'm not going to argue with you. They very well could be. It's very hard for me to distinguish, like I said, between some of these teams within the top 6, these what most people consider to be the best of the best this year. One of these 6 teams is winning the national title, aren't they? Mostly, yeah. If you had $100 and you had to put it either on a top 6 team, these top 6 teams, or anyone else, you'd put it on one of these top 6 teams. But I've got OU coming in at number 6. Of course, they had the Red River shootout this past week, right? Didn't they? Yeah, of course they did. What'd they do? Well, they beat Texas. Where's that score? 34-27. So a pretty good game. Texas is one of those teams. I mentioned Auburn and Oregon being 11 and 12. I guess you'd probably have Texas at 13, right? Yes, they have 2 losses, but they're 2 pretty good losses. Let's be real, okay? They lost by a couple of scores at home to LSU, and then they lose on a neutral field here by 1 score to Oklahoma. So their 2 losses are both to top 6 teams that are still both undefeated. So Texas definitely has the 2 best losses of any 2-loss team. Texas deserves and should be ranked ahead of a ton of 1-loss teams. And if this was a top 13, I would probably have Texas right there after Auburn and Oregon in the 11-12 spot. But a good win for OU, right? A lot of people were wondering, how was OU going to look with Jalen Hurts? This was their toughest test of the season. They passed the test. Did they look as good offensively as they looked playing some of these nobodies? Obviously not. But Oklahoma's defense is not great. It's not even really good, but it's average to maybe a little bit above average. But considering where they came from last year, that's a huge improvement. They were, in the 110s, 120s in every defensive category last year, Oklahoma was. They're up into the, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s in all the different categories this year. So a huge improvement from Oklahoma. And forget the stats, just watch Oklahoma play. You can tell that Alex Grinch has brought a new attitude to that Oklahoma defense. They look like a much improved unit on that side of the ball, and that's going to make Oklahoma a way more difficult out should they make the playoffs than it has the last few years. But a good win for Oklahoma. They host West Virginia next week. I have them number 6 this week in the UNCLELOU Top 10 poll. All right, coming in at number 5, I have Wisconsin. It's hard to find a more impressive-looking team when you look at teams' records and the scores than Wisconsin. They have 4 shutouts this year. 4. Now, you're going to tell me they haven't played a lot of quality competition, and I agree with you. But I can name, well, hell, every team in this top 10 has played some terrible teams. Nobody has 4 shutouts except Wisconsin. There's teams that don't have 4 shutouts total over the last decade. There's teams that don't have 4 shutouts over the last quarter of a century. It's very hard to shut a team out. Wisconsin's got 4 shutouts, including this past weekend at home against Michigan State, winning 38-0. Again, I would put a win over Michigan State in the good category. It's a good win. It's not a great win. Michigan State's offense is just horrible. They do have a pretty good defense, and Wisconsin was still able to put 38 up on them. If you remember the week before, Ohio State put 34 on them. So this Ohio State-Wisconsin game, the LSU-Florida game got a lot of hype for good reason, and it ended up being a great game. This Wisconsin-Ohio State game deserves every bit of hype that LSU-Florida game had. This Wisconsin-Ohio State game coming up is going to be probably the game of the year so far in college football for a lot of obvious reasons. But Wisconsin gets to win this week, 38-0. They're on the road next week at Illinois, so they're going to win again. Hell, they may get another shutout. Illinois is a terrible team. Go on the street and ask 100 people to name every team in the Big Ten. What percentage of those 100 people are going to even name Illinois? 10%, 15%? Not very many. So that, the Wisconsin train will continue to roll on next week on the road at Illinois. And again, people are just waiting on that Wisconsin-Ohio State game. But I've got them in the poll this week at number 5. Number 4, I've got LSU. And listen, I said a minute ago you can make a case for any team in the top 6 to be number 1. You can really make a case for LSU to be number 1. They have 2 really good wins, Texas and now, of course, a 2-touchdown win over Florida. They look really good, especially on offense. There are some people that still have some question marks about their defense, and I think those are legitimate questions. Not that LSU's defense is bad, but anyone that's watched LSU play over the last couple of years and watched them play this year knows 2 things. Their offense is light years ahead of anything we've seen from LSU in a long, long time, and their defense is not quite at the level that we're used to seeing it at. Those 2 things are just undeniable. So some people still have some questions about LSU on the defensive side of the ball, and if that defense is going to be able to hold up against somebody like an Alabama. I don't think this is fair. I think a lot of people are holding back on LSU until they see them play Alabama because of how one-sided the game was last year. I don't think that's fair, and I don't think you'll find very many people that will admit they're doing that, but subconsciously, it is hard to forget that LSU got shut out 29-0 last year by Alabama. I know that last year doesn't matter for this year, and LSU is a totally different team, and so is Bama. Bama's defense not that great this year either, especially compared to what we're used to seeing from a Nick Saban defense. But the point is, it's just hard not to know that happened last year. And I think that's working against LSU right now in some people's minds. Not necessarily the other polls that you see. I'm just talking about college football fans in general. And you guys know I hear from a ton of fans from coast to coast all day long, every day. And I'm just telling you, this is sort of the vibe I get about LSU. The good news is it doesn't matter what anyone thinks about LSU at this point, okay? If LSU plays Alabama and wins, whether it's by 1 point, 3 points, 7 points, or 107 points, they will be the number one team in America in every single poll you can find. I don't care what any other team in this top 5 or 6 does during that time period. It does not matter. If LSU is undefeated when they go to Tuscaloosa and LSU beats them, they will be number one in every single poll on planet Earth, period. And they will 100% deserve it. And like I said, the argument can be made that they deserve it now. They've got 2 wins that, in my opinion, are better than any win Alabama has and any win Clemson has. Who has Alabama? What win that Alabama has is better than LSU's win over Texas or LSU's win over Florida? What win that Clemson has is better than LSU's win over Texas or LSU's win over Florida? Now, obviously, when you watch Alabama and Clemson play, you can tell they're really good teams. And I don't need to see Alabama or Clemson beat a top 10 team to know that. I have the superpower. My God-given superpower is the ability to watch football games and have a pretty good idea of which teams are good and which teams aren't. And Alabama and Clemson are pretty good, and we'll talk more about them in a second. But I've got LSU coming in this week at number 4. At number 4 on my poll. And who do they play this week? Let's see. On the road at Mississippi State, who lost to Tennessee last week. So it does not look, unless LSU gets caught napping after that big home win against Florida. And, man, it would have to be a serious nap. I don't see them losing that game on the road at Mississippi State. They're going to continue to roll on, most likely, with a fairly easy win, I would assume, on the road at a terrible Mississippi State team that's got quarterback issues. And in my opinion, and I've been saying this since he was hired, head coaching issues. Moorhead, I don't think Moorhead will be at Mississippi State very long. I've said that since the day he was hired, and the more, as time goes on, that's looking more and more likely. But there's LSU, number 4 in my poll. Number 4 in my in my poll to win over Florida. All right, number 3 this week in my top 10, I have Clemson. All right. Obviously, they moved up one because Georgia lost. But so I've got Clemson coming in at number 4. For all the bad things people have said about Clemson offensively over the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season, you have to say that many good things about their offense after this past weekend. They went out and absolutely destroyed Florida State. Again, you can tell me how terrible Florida State is, and God knows I agree. Willie Taggart doesn't know what the hell he's doing. This is the second year in a row he's lost by, 40 points or whatever it is to the Taters. But that is a good win. Florida State, for as bad as they've looked at times under Willie Taggart, they're the second most talented team in the ACC, period. I mean, there's no question or doubt about that, right? Coaching is the issue there, scheme, philosophy maybe, but they're the second most talented team in the ACC. Is Virginia playing pretty good? Yeah, they don't have a more talented roster than Florida State. Stop it. Does Miami? No. North Carolina? No. Pitt? Wake Forest? No. Florida State's the second most talented team in the SEC, and Clemson absolutely destroyed them at home this past week, 45-14. The offense finally looked like the offense that we expected to see from Clemson all year long. And some people were questioning Clemson, and I think for legitimate reasons. Listen, people were, I mentioned how I felt like people were holding LSU's 29-0 loss to Alabama the year before against LSU, and that wasn't necessarily fair or the right thing to do, but it's just subconsciously, it's hard to forget that happened. For the first 5 or 6 weeks of this season, Clemson was getting a bump based on a dominating win over Alabama from last year, right? That's undeniable. If polls didn't come out till week 3 or 4, I'm not sure Clemson would have been a top 10 team at that point because they just weren't playing like one. All that's out the window now. Now they are playing like the team we thought we would see all year long. Travis Etienne with over 100 yards for the first time since week 1. Trevor Lawrence had his best game, in my opinion. Justin Ross finally decided to show up for Clemson. It was just a really good game all the way around for Clemson. They were coming off a bye week, and it looks like they took that bye week to figure out whatever it is that was going on with that offense. They got it fixed. If you're on Clemson's schedule for the remainder of this year, you need to be worried. They looked really, really good. I've got them at number 3 this week in the poll. Who do they play this coming up week? Clemson plays at Louisville, who beat an undefeated team last week in Wake Forest. Can they make it 2 in a row with a win over Clemson at home this coming up week? No. Come on. Stop it. What are you talking about? All right, number 2, I've got Alabama. They had a big win this weekend, too, 47-28 over Texas A&M. Again, with the defense. They're giving up a lot of points, but they are scoring twice as many points most of the time. So I'm not here to try to convince you Alabama's a bad team or anything like that. But again, it's sort of an LSU situation. And it started with Alabama really a year or 2 ago. But a totally revamped offense for Alabama that's putting up way more points with sort of an aired-out offense, something you're not used to seeing from Alabama and Nick Saban. But the defense not quite as good as it was 4, 5, 6 years ago. Same can be said for LSU. But Bama comes out and dominates Texas A&M on the road, 47-28. Tua broke all kind of records. They had Nick Saban dancing circles around his own self in the press conference after the game. He brought back the rat poison reference from a few years ago because people are heaping all this praise on Tua, and you know that makes Saban mad. He doesn't want anybody saying anything good about his team or his players. Plus, he's just an asshole when it comes to dealing with the media. That's just how it is for Nick Saban. That's not a surprise to anybody at this point. But a lot of people, myself included, thought if Alabama was going to lose a game at all this year, it was going to be that one on the road at Texas A&M. Now, obviously, Texas A&M's not been anywhere near the team that some people expected them to be. They've looked awful at times. They didn't look awful in this game. Kellen Mond did okay, but again, they just couldn't keep up with Alabama. Alabama made the plays on defense when they needed to, and offensively, they were able to do just about anything they wanted to do. They ran the ball well. I mentioned Tua. Alabama's offense is a well-oiled machine. It's going to take a special performance by any type of defense to slow that thing down this year. We'll see if anybody can do it. But they did beat Texas A&M 47-28. They host Tennessee this weekend. Tennessee coming off their first SEC win of the season with that home win against Mississippi State. And, man, are the Gumps excited or what? Yeah, they're excited. Why? This is their first night game of the season. Why is that important? Besides Nick Saban constantly crying and complaining about all the noon games that Alabama has had to play this year, with the whole that's not fair thing and complaining to the SEC office and CBS and ESPN about some conspiracy that doesn't exist to keep Alabama off of primetime TV. So, yeah, that's one reason they're excited. But the main reason they're excited in Gumpville, in T-Town, the number one reason they're excited to be playing at night this coming up weekend, playing under the lights. What lights? The red lights they copied from my Georgia Bulldogs. That's right. Tune in this weekend, ladies and gentlemen, to see Alabama beat the bejesus out of Tennessee at home. But most importantly, tune in so you can see a copycat version of the LED light show that you saw a couple of weeks ago in Athens. So shout out to Nick Saban and the people over at Alabama for copying what Georgia did. All right, number 1, again, in my poll, I have Ohio State. I'm not going to move Ohio State out of number 1 just because they were on a bye week. They've looked absolutely dominant every single week. There hasn't been a team in all of college football, with the exception of maybe Wisconsin, that has looked as good as Ohio State has looked on both sides of the ball week in and week out. They've been consistently one of, if not the best-looking teams in all of college football week in and week out this entire season. Top 10 in total defense and total offense. Top 5 in scoring offense and scoring defense. Heisman candidate quarterback in Justin Fields. J.K. Dobbins looks like the J.K. Dobbins we saw 2 seasons ago, as opposed to the one that showed up last season like he didn't know what he was doing. Ohio State's defense, which has been his Achilles heel over the last couple of years, looks like it has taken a bunch of steps forward. Talked about the Oklahoma defense, right? Oklahoma was starting out heading into this year with like the 120th best defense. So they improve a lot. That puts them at 50 or 60. Ohio State already had a top 50 defense. They improve a lot. That puts them top 10. Ohio State's a dangerous team. Again, they haven't had a down week. They haven't had a week where you watch them and go, I don't know. Look at, nothing. They haven't had a week where the offense had to bail out the defense or the defense had to bail out the offense. They've just been dominant in every single game that they've played. I've had them at number 1 for a couple of weeks now. I mentioned they play Wisconsin coming up soon. They're going to play Penn State. They're going to play Wisconsin. So the Big Ten is a lot like the SEC right now. You've got a handful of teams that are sort of grouped in the top 10, top 12, top 15, however far out you want to go. And the majority of those teams are going to play each other, and somebody is going to have to lose those games. So we're going to see a lot of changes within not just my top 10, but every top 10 over the next month. By the time the playoff polls, the official playoff poll starts to come out in November, the one the playoff committee puts out starting in November, a lot of this stuff is going to be pretty obvious. They're like right now, if the playoff committee had to put out a playoff poll right now, I would feel sorry for them because, like I said, I think there are 6 teams that without question deserve to be top 4. But, of course, only 4 can be top 4. By the time that poll comes out, some of these teams are going to have losses, I would expect. So we'll see. But anyway, that's the poll. What does Ohio State do this week? Where are they at? Let's see. They play at Northwestern. So coming off a bye, they got to go on the road to Northwestern. Northwestern is they're an okay team. They're not very good. Most people, I think, are going to expect Ohio State to win that game by 3 to 4 touchdowns minimum. I know it's on the road. I know Pat Fitzgerald's a pretty good coach. Talent-wise, Northwestern just, shouldn't be competing with a team like Ohio State. But, of course, South Carolina shouldn't be competing with a team like Georgia, and they did. So we'll see. Anyway, that's this week's top 10 poll. Feel free to tell me down below where you think I'm wrong, which I'm sure is just about every spot on the board here. But anyway, I appreciate you guys watching. Have a great morning.